There's a ruling out of a court in Missouri that's a little bit complicated. We'll take a peek at that story and talk about it. Where basically, I think it's Missouri. They want to make their state into a sanctuary state for the Second Amendment. And an Obama appointed judge says, no, that violates the Constitution. And we'll have to talk about whether or not it does. It doesn't. We'll have to talk about it because there isn't like a definitive answer. You know, you got to really be on both sides of this issue. It doesn't violate the Constitution. It's a retarded ruling. There's really just a whole lot of different ways you could look at this. Nope, just one. Really, there's just one way. And the judge's reasoning is absolutely fucking retarded. So, federal judge rules Missouri gun laws unconstitutional. Now, what's funny about this is written, this headline is written. You got to remember this is an NBC News headline, but it's written as if it's from a right-wing publication, right? Oh, a Missouri gun law is unconstitutional. This isn't a Missouri gun law. Let's be very clear. This isn't a gun law. This is a police law, a law enforcement law. This is not regulating guns. This is regulating law enforcement. So let's talk about what's going on here. The Justice Department sued last year over the state law which declared invalid several federal gun regulations that don't have equivalent statutes in Missouri. All right, so a Missouri law that declared several federal gun laws invalid is unconstitutional. A U.S. federal judge ruled on Tuesday, handing the U.S. Justice Department a victory in its bid to get the law tossed out. We should already be pissed off about this. If the government is suing the federal government, do you think it's on behalf of you? Do you think it's on behalf of you? Is the federal government helping you out with a lawsuit? No, it's protecting its own fucking power every single time. Oh, the federal government's going to sue somebody. Why? For themselves. And that's what's going on here. They're not interested in you, your freedom. They're not interested in anything like that at all. They are interested only in preserving their own power. It is the rule of government that government exists to perpetuate and propagate itself and nothing else. At issue was a measure Republican Governor Mike Parson signed into law in 2021 that declared that certain federal gun laws infringed on the rights of individuals to keep and bear arms under the U.S. Constitution's Second Amendment. So here we go. Yet again, we have a state determining that the federal government is violating its constitutional obligation to protect the right to keep and bear arms. You know, the thing that's fucking written down. It's written down. It was so damn important that they said, you know what? We're not going to allow debate on this. We're not going to allow votes on this. We're not going to allow laws to affect this. We're going to just say, nope, you cannot infringe on the right of people to keep and bear arms. You cannot do it. What does the government do constantly? Infringe. It's all they want to do all the time. And of course, the government has been doing it specifically heavily since 1939. And we have states lately waking up and saying, fuck you. No, you can't do this. The federal government is not upholding their end of the deal. The state says we're going to protect the rights of the citizenry even more than the Constitution. Now, what's interesting is that states always have the ability to protect your rights more than the federal government will. Except here, when you have an Obama-appointed judge being an absolute bitch. U.S. District Judge Brian Wimes in Jefferson City, Missouri, said the state's Second Amendment Preservation Act violates the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause, which holds that federal laws take priority over conflicting state laws. First of all, those laws have to actually be in conflict. There has to be a real conflict of law for the federal government to have the possibility of supremacy, and it's not 100% guaranteed. Then they're not preventing the enforcement of federal law by federal law enforcement. What they're doing is saying that Missouri law enforcement cannot participate in depriving people of their rights. They can't do that. That's it. Again, there has to be an actual conflict with the state law. I don't think there is one here. Wimes, an appointee of former President Barack Obama, in a siding with Democratic President Joe Biden's administration, called the practical effects of the Republican-led state's law counterintuitive to its stated purpose. Nope. Not at all, actually. While purporting to protect citizens, SAPA exposes citizens to greater harm by interfering with the federal government's ability to enforce lawfully enacted firearms regulations designed by Congress for the purpose of protecting citizens, he wrote. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, a Republican, in a statement promised an appeal, saying he was committed to defending Missourians' fundamental right to bear arms. Do we have how long is this? Uncontroverted facts. 1934, Congress enacted the National Firearms Act. Let's take a pause for a minute. If we're talking about unconstitutional laws, one of the most blatantly, facially unconstitutional laws in the history of the United States is the National Firearms Act of 1934. Period. Full stop. Fuck off. If you disagree, you are wrong. There is no way around this. It says in the Constitution, under the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. Keep and bear arms. Not reasonable arms, not approved arms, not acceptable arms, not common use at the time arms, not non-military arms, not military arms, just fucking arms. Just it. That's it. All of them. Forever. Every single one of them. The right to keep and bear arms. Period. Shall not be infringed. There is nowhere else to fucking go with this. And yet, loop-a-doop-a-doo, 1934, communism on the rise in the United States, very specifically at this time. And what happens? National Firearms Act comes along and infringes on the rights of the people to keep and bear arms. This would be challenged under U.S. versus Miller in 1939. Miller would die prior to his case getting to the Supreme Court, and his attorney would just decide not to argue the case. And the federal government is the only entity that argues U.S. v. Miller before the Supreme Court of the United States. And shockingly, the Supreme Court sides with the only entity that argued, the federal government. U.S. v. Miller is a travesty of American jurisprudence. U.S. v. Miller codifies into law the National Firearms Act, which specifically does the literal fucking opposite of what the Second Amendment says. And your rights were truncated by a government that allowed itself to be the sole voice in a controversy between the government and the citizenry. And we're supposed to be okay with this. We're supposed to say this is constitutional. This is good. No, this is right. This has lasted forever. Imagine if we allowed this anywhere else. Imagine if we tolerated this with other rights. Imagine if we tolerated the notion of how this played out in 1939. So Miller dies, let's say of natural causes. Why does his attorney drop out? He just doesn't care about the case anymore. He just did a bunch of work and he's like, you know what? Actually, I don't mind. What if I posit to you that the government threatened to end that attorney's license, life, existence, family in order to gain control over the people through this law? What is the most terrifying thing for a government? It's an armed populace. It always has been. Every government throughout all of time. They're terrified when the populace gained weapons of war that rivaled the government's ability to wage it. The government suddenly realized it was on the losing end of the conflict. Now, a sword's a sword, right? A spear's a spear. You hold a spear, another guy holds a spear, you come into conflict, one of you's coming out on top based on skill of arms. 10 people come at you with a spear, and you have one spear. You're very likely to lose that, no matter how good you are at anything. Sure, there are anomalies, but the reality is, the more spears you have, the more swords you have, the more likely it is that the one individual will lose. That changed dramatically with guns. You have a large amount of ammunition that is easily transportable, that is imminently lethal. They can be wielded by one person effectively against any number of targets. The amount of people that you have to overcome one semi-automatic weapon is a number significantly higher than the capacity of the weapon. And there's some guns with some large capacity. I'm not just talking about magazines. We're talking about belt feeds. We're talking about high yield explosive devices. So what happens when a government isn't just 1v1ing you, bro, with a sword, or 10v1ing you, bro, with a sword? What if it's 50 federal agents, but you've got a drum-fed AR-15 with 100 shots? Okay, 50 federal agents, not as threatening anymore. The calculus changed. Now, with each person that you add to that one, you multiply vastly the amount of government resources needed to suppress individuals. Look at Waco. We talked about Waco the other day. Look at what it took. Look at the Bundy Ranch, Clive and Bundy. Look at what it took, because there's like 5, 6 guys with guns. Now imagine instead of a gun, you have a tank. You have a 20 millimeter machine gun mounted on a Humvee. The amount of havoc you can wreak with that is astronomical. Doesn't happen very often. It's not because of the law, by the way. The law isn't what's preventing this. It's the impracticality and the lack of people's general will to go after a government. They know it's a death sentence. But it's not about going after the government. It's about protecting yourself from government, and it always has been. The government is terrified of their inability to regulate us when we have access to the same weapons of war that they do, or even inferior weapons of war, but still have mass destructive capability. The National Firearms Act was aimed to curb that and has been implemented further and further and further to continue curbing it, culminating in the outlawing of the effective outlawing of machine guns for the majority of Americans, by preventing the new manufacture of them, by artificially driving up the price to unattainable levels. You're talking about $20,000, $25,000 for a machine gun. They had to all be manufactured before 1986. They made it a finite commodity. All of this through one unconstitutional law in 1934. It's the first citation that this guy has. Why? Because all fucking cucks cite to the National Firearms Act. All of them. Whenever you talk about guns, but we can regulate guns. Look, we did. Every single time. Just know that it was unconstitutional when it was passed. It was unconstitutional when the bullshit communist court upheld it in 1939. It's been unconstitutional ever since. And it better be on the fucking chopping block after New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, because the new standard says we have to have a historical tradition dating back to the Constitution of regulating guns in this particular way. And the National Firearms Act has no historical tradition prior to its existence. None. But that's where this all boils down to. It all goes back. This is the first major, I think it's the first federal gun regulation that exists. It's passed in 1934. 140 years after the Constitution? We get the idea on this. I think you guys are with me. The entire purpose of this bill is to prevent the forced enforcement of federal law by Missouri state actors. That's the purpose. Look, in Missouri, fuck off, feds. Feds, do it yourself. We're not helping you. We will not be party to the infringement on the rights of our citizens. And a judge comes along and says, a state can't do that. Yes, they can. They can't stop the federal government from enforcement, right? Now, if the feds want to send 2,000 extra agents for enforcement to Missouri, the feds can do that. That's up to them. They can say, well, we don't have our intergovernmental task force anymore, our interagency task force. Therefore, we now need full enforcement from just federal agents. They could do that. So this thing's going to get appealed. I don't know how the appeal is going to work out, but I think the reasoning provided by the judge is poor. I think there's plenty of grounds to argue with it. And I think under New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, they can bring that in. They can attack directly. The laws, the GCA and the National Firearms Act, as presumptively unconstitutional under in NYSRPA versus Bruin. And that's where I really want to go with all of this gun talk, is that all of the laws, all of the gun laws that exist everywhere are subject. They're all subject to the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, because none of them have a historical tradition in the United States. And if you had told our founders that, oh yeah, well, people can have guns, but we're just going to force them to register all of them on a list that's held by the government when they buy them. Wait, so whenever anyone buys a gun, you're going to put it on a list? If the government has a list of everyone and their address and all that stuff? Yeah, that's what we're going to do. I don't like that. I don't like that. It goes against the very notion of how our country was founded. So we'll see. This one is in federal court. It'll go to the Federal Appeals Court and then potentially up to the Supreme Court. Will the Supreme Court take it? That's a different question. The Supreme Court is eventually going to have to further clarify Bruin. But that could be a ways off. The idea that any of these laws were ever constitutional is offensive to the notion of the Constitution. And so we'll see. We'll see what the Eighth Circuit does. And then we'll see, of course, what the Supreme Court does, if they do anything. But my position is very fucking clear. All gun laws that apply to law-abiding citizens and restrict their ability to have guns in any way are facially offensive to the Constitution and the Second Amendment and the plain text of it, and should be found unconstitutional immediately.
So pour out an odd bag of Balmore and Lafroig. Spirits flow as the ones who get unemployed. So pour out a glass for the tea post on Twitter as we hear Lost Painting tonight. From the white shores of Nairn to the hills of Glenlivet, there's no one who explains the thought better than Nick. So pour